Assalamu alaikum and welcome to another episode of the British Muslim Women's Podcast. My name is Iffat Mirza and today I'm joined by my guests Nooresahar Ahmed, a student at the University of Oxford reading English literature, and Melissa, an RE teacher and mother of two. Welcome to the podcast. How's it going today?
Alaikum salam. Jazakallah for having us.
Alaikum salam. I'm good. Alhamdulillah.
Yeah, it's an absolute pleasure having you both. So obviously, it's been just over 2 years now since the COVID-19 pandemic struck, and now we're kind of moving towards a post-pandemic society. It is perhaps worth taking a moment to just reflect on the last 2 years, because I think it was quite hectic and we were all going through one thing so quickly. Well, not just one thing, but a series of things that we might not have had a time to reflect. So it was definitely like this moment of uncertainty, fatigue, but also in some cases of rejuvenation and actually personal growth. So I'm interested to hear about your thoughts about one very specific aspect of the pandemic, which kind of struck me. And I would say it's an aspect of life which should be applicable at all times, but has really come to the forefront of the conversation during the pandemic. And that was the idea of social responsibility. So personally, I feel like throughout the pandemic, we've been thinking a lot about what it is to be selfless and selfish. And obviously, if we cast our minds back to March 2020, we saw a lot of panic buying, which I suppose on reflection was a little bit understandable, as we were on the brink of heading into a new global chapter where no one really knew what was about to happen. But on the other hand, it also did show quite a selfish side of society, I think, where it became a matter of hoarding far more than we needed or could even actually store, and therefore making life very difficult for others who couldn't access basic essentials, particularly key workers, the elderly, vulnerable, or just people with less disposable income who cannot afford to buy more than what was imminently needed for them. But we also did see a lot of amazing work being done by local communities to ensure that no one was left behind in these uncertain times. So, for example, I know in my local area, a lot of volunteers quickly set up a food donations committee, as well as other essentials, such as computers and laptops for children who are now home learning or people who are having to work from home. So what I'm trying to say, I think, is that this pandemic really exposed two ends of the spectrum when it came to social responsibility. So just to get the conversation going, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. And Nooresahar, if I come to you first, do you think that the desire to help our communities is something that is inherent, or is it something which needs to be cultivated?
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting question, and I agree. I think the idea of social responsibility during the pandemic definitely came to the fore, and it's really interesting to think about it now that some time has passed. And to answer your question, I think that in terms of the desire to help our communities, inherent or something that we need to cultivate, I would say that it's a mixture of both. I think that we are naturally inclined to do good for others and help our communities. In part, I think just because it makes us feel better to help other people. So my mom always says that if you're having a hard time yourself or struggling mentally, then one way to feel better and to improve your condition is to do something helpful for someone else. And it's true. I mean, studies have found that acts of kindness are linked to increased feelings of well-being. So helping others can also improve our support networks and encourage us to be more active, which then in turn can improve our self-esteem. So there is some evidence to suggest that when we help others, it can promote changes in the brain that are linked with happiness. So I think that it's a natural urge to want to help other people, and we sort of know that it will in turn make us feel better. But that being said, I think it is also really easy to get wrapped up in your own life and your own problems. And so it's really important to also cultivate this urge to help out in our communities. So for example, the Holy Quran definitely encourages this urge. And there's one verse which I'll quote. It's from chapter 4, verse 37, quote, "And worship Allah and associate not with him, and show kindness to parents and to kindred and orphans and the needy, and to the neighbour that is a kinsman and the neighbour that is a stranger, and the companion by your side and the wayfarer and those whom your right hands possess," unquote. And another thing that this question actually brings to my mind is an article I read during the earlier months of the pandemic, which now feels like a really long time ago. But it was about how in Pakistan, many people were paying their zakat, which is the traditional Muslim charity tax, to daily wage earners. So these are people who have no paid leave or health insurance or financial safety net. And so they were being hit the hardest by lockdowns and the lack of work. If you want to read it, it was on the BBC. It was called The Law of Generosity Combating Coronavirus in Pakistan, I think. But I bring this up because I think it's the perfect example of how cultivation of the natural desire to help mankind can really make an impact on other people's lives.
Jazakallah, Nooresahar. That sounds like a really interesting article, and I like the idea of it, kind of like that law, because it's kind of like, if you think of Islam, it kind of almost has its legal system, but that legal system is one that's based on generosity and taking care of one another. Like that's like the idea behind like all like jurisprudence in Islam. And going off of this, Melissa, so you're a mother of two, like two very adorable little ones. Do you feel like social responsibility is something that young children need to be made aware of, and how so?
Yeah, completely. So kids, they just thrive when they feel useful. And it's the same as adults do too. When you feel useful, you feel like you're able to contribute. It's like what Nooresahar was saying, it helps your well-being. So to take my own example, during the pandemic, I was blessed to have my second child, my son, during the first lockdown, alhamdulillah, and he's just turned 2. So yeah, COVID has definitely warped time. But trying to encourage that social responsibility, it's a parent's everyday reality and also challenge. Like one of the first difficulties a toddler can face is the concept of sharing. So although babies, they have the cognitive ability and understanding of what it means to have something, or object possession from a very early age, but of course they cry when you take something away, or you have something that they want. So in some ways, the certain aspects of selfish behavior is rooted in self-preservation and the need to survive, right? This goes back to a long time ago. But social responsibility starts with having little jobs and showing, especially with children, showing children how they can be useful and productive in a family environment. And then if this foundation is there, they're able to then go beyond just the home environment or the family environment the older they get, and then extend that wing of mercy to other people as well. So when you give children independence to do jobs around the house, for example, for other family members, like setting the table, putting their plates in the sink, little jobs, but then they learn through observation, right? When they're young, they're watching you all the time. So they're absorbing everything you do as a parent or primary caregiver, if they're at nursery, for example. So they see you taking social responsibility, and then they learn that as normal behavior. And then it's ingrained then from a young age that if you take social responsibility, then that's a way that you can then serve others, and it's then ingrained within your personality. So then they're learning it's a good thing to be there and to be present and to basically show up for other people, because other people will need you in your life. And better still, it's better to be there for someone before they call upon you and to anticipate that need. That's a very human thing, I think. So it's a constant thing for parents to remind our children that this concept of sharing, it's the building blocks of society at a very, very basic level. So when they become older, sharing resources, sharing knowledge and everything, it makes the world more fair and equitable. And it all starts in the early years, in my opinion.
Jazakallah, Melissa, for being able to contribute that unique perspective to our conversation. And I find it really interesting that you bring up the idea to kind of instill that, almost that ability to anticipate when somebody might need help and be there for them before they ask for it, because it can be really difficult to ask for help for a number of reasons. Maybe just it's like a personal habit, like a personal like reluctance to need other people, or a matter of kind of being a bit shy, sometimes even in case a bit embarrassed to kind of have to ask for help. So I think it's really, really important for us to touch upon that idea of teaching our future generations how to anticipate people needing help, so that you can be that helping hand before they have to kind of call upon you. So yeah, as I say, Jazakallah. So I'm also very glad to say that the Lajna Ima'illah, that is the women's branch of the Ahmedi Muslim community, was also very active throughout the pandemic here in the UK, and taking on what they felt was their responsibility and duty to their local communities, and kind of did that straight away as soon as it struck. So what sort of things did you guys see the women's branch of the community do?
I think, and just before I answer, I'll agree with you, Iffat. I really liked what you said, Melissa, about the anticipating people's needs. And I think that my whole life, long before the pandemic, I have seen the women's branch of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community doing that continually and reaching out to support the larger community, and kind of anticipating what people who are most in need of something will require. So at my own local mosque, for example, we always had donation bins for food and clothes to go to local shelters. And there was a container for donating things for babies. So like clothes, nappies, baby food, all those kinds of things, because there was a local hospice in the area, which was for struggling parents. And during the pandemic, I don't think any of these things would have been halted by our women's communities, or at least not for very long. And I think reaching out to those in need in our communities is always, and has always been, and will always be, a top priority. Something that I also thought was really nice, like specific to the pandemic, was there was a push to provide resources to help parents who were suddenly having to teach their own children when schools were closed. So I just think in general, it's really comforting to know that you belong to a community of women who are always looking out for each other, who will anticipate those needs. So for example, you know, send over food if you're unwell, or they feel like you might be struggling, or just to be nice.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think, yeah, it's that matter of just kind of, it's also the little things, isn't it, which can just kind of completely change somebody's day. And Melissa, what did your local Lajna and the community get up to during the pandemic?
So in our local area, we had virtual coffee mornings. So I know Nooresahar was just talking about anticipating that physical need that people have, you know, for physical things and food and nappies and things like that, which is the primary thing. But what I'm talking about here with the coffee mornings is like tapping into that spiritual need and that need for human connection with other people. And obviously we couldn't meet physically, so we tried our best to do that virtually online. So we had these coffee mornings with the local faith-based community. And this is something that happened all over the UK during COVID, with virtual events taking place regularly. So that was really important to stay connected with local friends and neighbours and communities, and keeping those ties of neighbourly relations that we had, and keeping that going, and offering a chance for people to get together and learn something new as well about each other's worldviews, because, you know, we all have that spiritual need too, whether we tap into it or not. So loneliness was one of the biggest killers aside from the COVID virus itself. And I'm very fortunate and very humbled to say that the Ahmedi Muslim community, the Women's Association, were at the forefront of extending that hand of friendship to others. And it was necessary to sustain all of our mental health in that time for so many people. So I'm very blessed and fortunate that we were able to do that and be a part of it.
Indeed, I think, yeah, fortunate is definitely the word. And I think it's just so wonderful that during the pandemic, our local and national community kind of was able to band together and so quickly and almost effortlessly. I imagine, kind of like looking from the outside, it would seem like it was so easy to do. But alhamdulillah, it was, you know, with God's grace, that was something that the community was able to do, and, you know, be able to offer help and comfort in, you know, what were really dark days. So if I may, now I'd like to quote His Holiness Mirza Masroor Ahmed, may Allah be his helper, who sat at the 2018 Peace Symposium and spoke on the topic of leaving a legacy for future generations. In it, he said, and I quote, "People in all parts of the world, whether rich or poor, whether powerful or oppressed, whether religious or irreligious, towards justice and peace. Hence, we will continue to play our role in making mankind realize its duty towards respecting and honoring basic human values. The core teachings of Islam are to fulfill the rights of our Creator and to fulfill the rights of our fellow human beings." End quote. So my question for you would be, what do you think is the link between that recognition of a Creator and our social responsibility?
Well, I was reading an address by Al Khalifa, His Holiness Hazrat Mirza Masroor Ahmed, may Allah be his helper, which was from quite a while ago. It was back in 2005 at, I think, Jalsa, Uganda, which I think perfectly highlights and emphasizes this link between understanding our responsibility as Muslims to our Creator and to our fellow people, and how the two are linked. So he says in the sermon that, to quote him, quote, "Allah has placed great emphasis in the Holy Quran on Hukuk al-Abad, the rights of creation, along with Hukuk Allah, the rights owed to Allah." And he then quotes the promised Messiah, salam, that, quote, the main commandments of the Holy Quran are only two. Number one is the unity of God and love and obedience to the Almighty Creator, who possesses the greatest attributes. And number two, kindness towards one's brothers and mankind, unquote. So clearly in Islam, first and foremost is the belief in God, and then service to mankind. And those two go hand in hand with one another. And I think one should always motivate the other one as well.
Yeah, I'd like to add as well that in Islam, God has 99 attributes that we as humans can call upon. And his grace and his mercy are the two most mentioned attributes in the Holy Quran. And they're most often repeated by Muslims at large anyway. So I think the most humbling thing about the link between God and his service to his creation is that God is infinite and his attributes are also infinite. So our service to humankind should be endless too. And our level of sacrifice and dedication to serving and helping others can be done with these attributes with grace and mercy for others for the sake of God alone. So Nooresahar has spoken it beautifully about how these two things are intertwined, the service to God and service to humanity. And you can't have one without the other. So we have to serve our fellow human beings to be worthy of being a recipient of God's love and grace, in my opinion.
I think you have both provided some very interesting perspectives on that question, and within their own right could provide a podcast for hours and hours. I'll just kind of round off to my final question now, which will hopefully help to kind of conclude the conversation. And I think could, depending on your answers, be something incredibly optimistic or pessimistic. But in a world with extreme inequalities and a lot of apparent selfishness, which we do see today, unfortunately, how does one keep their chin up and stay committed to their pursuit of fulfilling others' rights?
Yeah, it's a great question. So there's this hadith that says that there was a man traveling along a road who felt extremely thirsty, and so he went down a well and drank. And when he came up, he saw a dog panting with thirst. And the man said, this animal is suffering from thirst just as much as I was. So he went down the well again, filled his shoe with water, and taking it in his teeth, climbed up out of the well and gave the water to the dog. And so God was pleased with his act and granted him pardon for his sins. So this is Bukhari, this hadith. And the thing that I take away from this in the context of this question is that no matter how much we're struggling or we feel lost, and whether that's on a personal level or just in general, you know, seeing what's going on in the world, watching the news, you know, it still is always worthwhile and always valuable, I think, to remember the rights of other beings and to try and do as much good for other people as we can while we're on this earth. And I think that it is a very difficult thing to remember. And like, I don't think the condition of the world necessarily inspires hope particularly, but it does bring me hope to think that however bad things are, we still have a personal ability to do good.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. Nooresahar, you just reminded me of another narration of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, who said that in matters of faith and piety, one should always look to those above you or those who are doing better than you. And in matters of worldly and material things, you should always look to those below you or people who have less than you. So I take that to mean that when you're constantly reminded by the fact that there's always more you can do to help alleviate someone's pain or struggle or hardship, whether it's through paying charity or going to see someone who's not well or having a chat with someone, these are all ways in which we can sort of help uplift other people in difficulty. And it reminds us never to be too comfortable as well in our times of ease, because the Holy Quran reminds us that we'll be tried by our wealth and our children. So it's through serving others that we can truly invoke God's mercy by trying to be merciful to others.
Thank you both, Nooresahar and Melissa, for joining me today and bringing up these really important points. I think there's a lot to kind of ponder upon, and there's a lot of food for thought there. And I hope you, our listeners, have enjoyed our conversation. I, for one, have found it very enlightening. And may I even say inspirational. Nooresahar, the hadith that you just mentioned, and Melissa, the hadith that both of you just mentioned, I think perfectly encapsulate the note on which I think we should and can wrap up on, that is the importance of empathy, and just kind of what it means to honor other people's rights, and how important that can be for others as well as for ourselves. Going back to the first thing that you said, Nooresahar, about your mother's advice of, if you're not feeling, high in spirits, help somebody else. I think that's a really, really nice way of thinking about it. That is it for today. Thank you very much for joining us on another episode of the British Muslim Women's Podcast.